Chapter 1. Introduction. Versailles as Myth and Reality. When you hear the name Versailles, you immediately think of the pomp, power, and splendor of the French kings. Hardly any other castle in the world has achieved such symbolic significance. Versailles is not just a building, but a myth, a symbol of the absolute monarchy, of the splendor of Louis XIV, of the splendor and downfall of the Ancien Regime. But at the same time, Versailles is also reality, a concrete place built with stone, wood, and gold, inhabited by people with their worries, intrigues, and passions, a place full of history and stories. The Palace of Versailles is more than just a royal residence. For over a century, it was the political center of France, the place where power was exercised, politics staged, and culture shaped. Not only the kings lived here, but also hundreds of nobles, ladies-in-waiting, servants, artists, and officials. Versailles was a universe of its own, a city within the city, a microcosm that was supposed to represent the entire country. At the same time, Versailles stands for the triumph of architecture and garden art. The palace, with its countless halls, galleries, and staterooms, is a masterpiece of Baroque architecture. Even more famous are the gardens of André Le Nôtre, a strictly ordered paradise where nature itself was forced to submit to the power of the king. The symmetry, the axes, the water features, everything served to embody the idea of absolute control and harmony. But Versailles is not only a symbol of greatness, but also of contradictions. While festivals were celebrated in the Hall of Mirrors, the common people often suffered from hunger and poverty. While the court indulged in luxury, discontent grew outside, which finally led to the revolution. Versailles is therefore also a memorial. It is a reminder of how much power can alienate through splendor, and how dangerous it is when rulers lose touch with reality. To this day, Versailles exerts an almost magical attraction. Every year, millions of visitors from all over the world flock to the castle to see the Galerie des Glaces, walk through the endless gardens, and immerse themselves for a moment in the world of the Sun King. At the same time, Versailles is a place of remembrance. It was here that the treaty was signed in 1919 that ended the First World War, an event that once again made the palace the scene of world political history. Versailles is both a place of beauty and a place of history, a building that inspires the imagination but also demands reflection. It is a myth that still has an effect today, and a reality that wants to be rediscovered again and again. Chapter 2. The Beginnings, from a hunting lodge to a royal dream. Before Versailles became one of the largest and most famous palaces in the world, it was nothing more than an inconspicuous village in Île-de-France. Surrounded by swampy meadows, dense forests, and fertile farmland, it initially served the French kings only as a hunting ground. As early as the 16th century, nobles and kings were drawn to this landscape, which was rich in game and ideal for hunting. However, the real history of Versailles begins with Louis XIII. The king, who reigned from 1610 to 1643, was a passionate hunter. In the woods of Versailles, he sought distance from the political hustle and bustle of the Parisian court. In order to make his stays there more pleasant, he had a small hunting lodge built in 1623, a simple building made of brick and stone, far from the splendor that was to follow later. It was a private retreat, a place of intimacy, not representation. This hunting lodge was not initially intended to become a political center, but it formed the core around which the enormous complex was to develop over the centuries. Louis XIII soon expanded it, had a chapel added, and expanded the complex, so that Versailles slowly took on the character of a royal residence. The choice of this place was not accidental. Versailles was at a convenient distance from Paris, close enough to reach the capital in a few hours, and yet far enough away to distance oneself from the intrigues and dangers of court life there. Even Louis XIII appreciated the tranquility, the hunting opportunities, and the scenic beauty. But Versailles remained a secondary town, a refuge during his lifetime. The real metamorphosis only began with his son, Louis XIV, the later Sun King. For him, the modest hunting lodge became the nucleus of a project that was second to none. Versailles was no longer to be just a place of hunting, but the center of power, a reflection of the absolute monarchy. So, if you look at the beginnings, there is a certain irony. What later became the greatest symbol of absolutist rule began as a modest escape from politics. A place of rest and hunting was transformed into a monumental theater of power. It is precisely this contrast that makes the history of Versailles so fascinating. A simple hunting lodge became a royal dream that amazed the whole of Europe. Chapter 3: Louis XIII and the First Buildings. The Palace of Versailles began its history not in splendor, but in simple restraint. Under Louis XIII, Versailles received its first solid contours, which were far removed from the splendor that is associated with this place today. Louis XIII, who reigned from 1610 to 1643, was a king of a quiet nature, not a great reformer or charismatic ruler like his son. But he loved hunting passionately and always sought out places where he could pursue this pleasure undisturbed. Versailles, with its forests, swamps, and wildlife, was the perfect choice. In order to make his stays there more pleasant, he had a small hunting lodge built in 1623. This first structure was mainly made of brick and stone, a rectangular building with a simple courtyard, practical and functional. It was so simple that it could hardly compete with other royal residences. But it was precisely this simplicity that made it so appealing. It was a place where the king could retreat, far from the strict ceremonial of the Parisian court. But Louis XIII was not satisfied with this for long. In the years that followed, he had the castle expanded. Around 1631, he commissioned the architect Philibert Leroy, who enlarged the building and made it a more handsome residence. He added side wings, designed a small chapel, and created rooms that could be used for the king's private life as well as for courtly receptions. The architecture of this early phase was characterized by restraint. Brick, light-colored stone corners, slate roofs, the style was typical of the French early Renaissance and still a far cry from the later Baroque exuberance. Nevertheless, it marked the beginning of a development that gradually turned Versailles into a royal project. The gardens also began to take shape under Louis XIII. Although they were nowhere near as spectacular as under Louis XIV, parterres and small ornamental gardens were already laid out here to frame the hunting lodge. The king wanted not only a functional place to stay, but also a pleasant refuge that was also aesthetically convincing. Versailles under Louis XIII was therefore a mixture. A hunting lodge with a residential character, simple and functional, but with the first signs of royal representation. No one had any idea that one day the largest castle in Europe would be built here. But the foundation was laid, a place that would give his son, Louis XIV, the opportunity to realize his vision of an absolute ruler. It could be said that Louis XIII gave the body to Versailles, while his son breathed the soul into it. Without these first buildings, Versailles would probably have remained an insignificant hunting refuge. But in the simple walls and the first extensions lay the seed for the monumental work that would later amaze the world. Chapter 4: Louis XIV, the famous Sun King, Versailles entered the dimension that makes it a worldwide symbol to this day. Under his reign, which lasted from 1643 to 1715, one of the longest in European history, his father's modest hunting lodge was transformed into the center of power, the heart of France, and a stage of absolutist rule. Louis XIV ascended the throne at the age of only 4, initially under the guardianship of his mother Anne of Austria and Cardinal Mazarin. Even at a young age, he had to experience how fragile royal power could be. During the Fronde, an uprising of the nobility and the Parisian citizenry, the king was even forced to flee Paris. This experience had a deep impact on him. He developed a lifelong mistrust of the capital and the old noble families. So he was looking for a place where he could stage and control his power unchallenged, and that place became Versailles. From the 1660s onwards, Louis XIV began to extensively rebuild and expand the castle. His father's simple building was to be turned into a residence that was not only comfortable but also embodied the king's greatness and glory. To do this, he commissioned the best architects, artists, and gardeners of his time. Louis XIV for the architecture, Charles Lebrun for the painting and decoration, and André Le Nôtre for the gardens. Together, they created a total work of art that is considered a prime example of the French Baroque. For Louis XIV, Versailles was more than a palace. It was a political instrument. In 1682, he officially moved the court to Versailles, far from Paris. In doing so, he drew the nobility from the capital to his immediate vicinity. Anyone who wanted influence had to be present in Versailles, take part in the daily rituals, and submit to the strict ceremonial of the king. The palace thus became a stage on which the nobility was tamed and the king was staged as the centerpiece. The nickname Sun King was no coincidence. Louis XIV compared himself to the sun, the center of the universe around which everything revolves. Versailles became the architectural embodiment of this idea. The king was the center of attention, and the palace, the gardens, and court life were arranged around him. Every look, every axis, every ceremony was aimed at making his power visible and tangible. The festivals that took place in Versailles were legendary. Music by Jean-Baptiste Lully, plays by Molière, magnificent ballet performances, and fireworks made the farm a cultural center of Europe. Everything was for the glory of the king. At the same time, these events were a means of politics. They tied the nobility to the court, distracted them from their own claims to power, and displayed the king's absolute authority. The nickname Sun King was no coincidence. Louis XIV compared himself to the sun, the center of the universe around which everything revolves. Versailles became the architectural embodiment of this idea. The king was the center of attention, and the palace, the gardens, and court life were arranged around him. Every look, every axis, every ceremony was aimed at making his power visible and tangible. The festivals that took place in Versailles were legendary. Music by Jean-Baptiste Lully, plays by Molière, magnificent ballet performances, and fireworks made the farm a cultural center of Europe. Everything was for the glory of the king. At the same time, these events were a means of politics. They tied the nobility to the court, distracted them from their own claims to power, and displayed the king's absolute authority. But Versailles was not only a symbol of power internally, but also externally. Envoys from all over Europe came to experience the splendor of the French court and took the image of an all-powerful king back to their countries. Numerous rulers, from Vienna to St. Petersburg, were inspired by Versailles and created their own palaces based on his model. Thus, under Louis XIV, Versailles became the center of a political, cultural, and architectural revolution. A hunting lodge had become the heart of French absolutism, a monument that immortalized the king's claim to unrestricted rule in stone and garden art. Chapter 5. The Architecture of Versailles, Splendor and Planning. The architecture of Versailles is more than mere architecture. It is a manifesto. Every detail, every facade, every axis served a higher purpose, the representation of absolute power. Under Louis XIV, Versailles was not simply built, it was designed to carve a worldview out of stone. When Louis XIV had his father's small hunting lodge expanded, he commissioned the architect Louis XIV, later also Jules Hardouin-Mansart, two of the most important master builders of their time. Lavaux created the first major extensions in the 1660s by having the old hunting lodge rebuilt. Instead of demolishing it, he integrated it into the new building, a symbolic act. The humble origins were not to disappear, but to be outshone by the splendor of the new project. The facades were designed in light stone, with clean lines, rhythmic windows, and majestic colonnades. In contrast to the vertical forms of the Gothic tradition or the playful elements of the Renaissance, Versailles relied on strict symmetry and horizontal expansion. Even from the outside, it should be visible that order, moderation, and control prevail here, just like in the kingdom ruled by Louis XIV. The interior of the castle was a masterpiece of Baroque interior design. One of the highlights is the famous Galerie des Glaces, the Hall of Mirrors, built by Jules Hardouin-Mansart between 1678 and 1684. With its 73 meters in length, high windows overlooking the garden, and 357 mirrors, it was a sensation. Mirrors were a luxury item at the time, and their arrangement reinforced the impression of infinite expanse and splendor. This is where the king staged himself at receptions, where contracts were signed, where the world power France was reflected in glass and gold. But it is not only the Hall of Mirrors that testifies to sophistication. The apartments of the king and queen have also been designed with the greatest care. Each room had a symbolic meaning. The king's daily routine was reflected in the architecture, from the bedroom where the Sun King held his levee ceremony to the staterooms where he held court. Architecture and ceremonial formed a unity, a perfect spectacle of power. The axis planning is particularly remarkable. The entire building is based on a main axis that leads from the castle through the gardens to the distance. This axis symbolized the order of the universe, with the king as the center. Everything was geometrically aligned: paths, water basins, avenues. The architecture did not stop at the walls, but continued in the landscape, a seamless interplay of building and garden. Another architectural highlight was the large number of outbuildings and pavilions. Opera house, chapels, orangeries, stables. Versailles was a city within a city, where thousands of people lived and worked. The palace was not only a residence, but also an administrative center, theater, church, and military base at the same time. The architecture of Versailles had a clear message. It was meant to impress, overwhelm, almost intimidate. Anyone who walked through the endless corridors, entered the huge halls, or wandered through the gardens should feel that there was a power here that knew no bounds. Versailles was a building that not only offered living space, but also transformed power into stone. This planning and the splendor made Versailles a model for many European palaces, from Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna to Peterhof in St. Petersburg. But none ever achieved the same effect. Versailles was and remained the archetype of absolutist architecture. Chapter 6. The Gardens of André Le Nôtre, Nature as a Staging of Power. As impressive as the architecture of Versailles is, the true soul of the palace is revealed in its gardens. Because what makes Versailles unique is not only the building, but the interplay of stone and nature, of order and landscape. It was here that it became clearest how Louis XIV wanted to inscribe his idea of absolute power into the world. Not only people, but also nature was to bow to his will. The man who realized this vision was the famous landscape architect André Le Nôtre. He had already made a name for himself with his work for the Tuileries in Paris and the Parc of Vaux-le-Vicomte. But in Versailles, he unfolded his genius in a hitherto unknown dimension. Le Nôtre's gardens were not romantic, natural grounds as they became fashionable centuries later. They were strictly geometric, with clear axes, symmetrical beds, and endless perspectives. The central idea was that the garden should reflect the order of the cosmos, and at the center of this cosmos stood the king. From the central axis that leads directly out of the castle, the garden unfolds like a universe that stretches into infinity. Straight lines, long avenues, reflecting water basins, and artfully trimmed hedges draw the eye into the distance. Every step, every line of sight was deliberately planned to overwhelm the visitor. The water features were another central element. Fountains, cascades, water basins, water was a symbol of life, wealth, and royal power. Since there were hardly any natural springs in Versailles itself, an elaborate system of canals, pumps, and reservoirs was created to make the fountains bubble. Particularly impressive were the performances of the Grands Eaux, in which all fountains were put into operation at the same time. It was a spectacle that amazed the guests, and at the same time, a demonstration of technical and organizational superiority. The gardens were also populated by statues and myths. Ancient gods, heroes, allegories. They all told stories that glorified the Sun King. The Apollo myth, with which Louis XIV identified himself, found a special expression here. Apollo, the sun god, became the king's artistic double, bringing light, order, and harmony to the world. But the gardens were not only decoration, but also a stage. Balls, theater performances, and fireworks took place here. Louis XIV used nature as a backdrop for an endless spectacle of power. Visitors from all over the world reported on these festivals, and the news of the splendor of Versailles spread throughout Europe. At the same time, the gardens were a place of everyday life at court. Courtiers strolled along the avenues, ladies showed off their dresses, musicians performed, conversations were held. Versailles was not only a place of politics, but also of the staging of social life. The gardens of Versailles remain one of the greatest masterpieces of garden art to this day. They show how nature can become an art form, and how this art simultaneously transports a political program. In every hedge, every visual access, every fountain, there is the message, nature itself bows to the will of the king. Thus, Versailles was not just a residence, but a cosmos, an ordered universe that made the power of the Sun King visible. And even today, when you walk through the endless paths and let your gaze wander over the symmetries, you can feel something of this idea, that here a man has forced nature to reflect his rule. Chapter 7. Life at Court: Etiquette, Rituals, and Intrigues. As magnificent as the architecture and gardens of Versailles were, the real heart of the palace was life at court. Versailles was not just a royal residence, but a huge theater where a spectacle of power was performed every day. Each day was steeped in rituals, etiquette, and a complex web of intrigue that made the court a unique microcosm. At the center of this cosmos stood the king himself. Louis XIV had Versailles built not only to surround himself, but also to control the nobility. By bringing the court to Versailles, he made the nobility dependent on his favor. Anyone who wanted influence had to be present in Versailles, and there was a strict set of rules that the king himself determined. The Sun King's daily routine was a public ritual. Even getting up in the morning, the so-called lever, was a ceremonial act. Courtiers were allowed to accompany the king while dressing, staggered according to rank. Every move, even the handing over of a shirt, was an honor that was carefully distributed. In the evening, there was the counterpart, the coucher, where the king was put to bed, also under the eyes of selected courtiers. These rituals turned the king's private life into a public staging. They had a clear function. They represented the king as the center of the universe, around whom everything revolved. At the same time, they bound the nobility to the court because everyone was anxious to get a place in these ceremonies, as this gave them prestige and influence. Social life at court also followed fixed rules. Meals, festivals, hunts, walks in the gardens, everything was part of the courtly game. Clothing played a central role in this. Anyone who wanted to appear at court had to comply with strict fashions, which were also ruinously expensive. In this way, Louis XIV kept the nobility in constant dependence. But Versailles was not only a stage, but also a place of constant intrigue. In the endless corridors, salons, and gardens, people talked, whispered, planned. Rivalries between noble families, jealousies between mistresses, power games between ministers. The castle was a seething web of interests. Louis XIV was a master at exploiting these intrigues by pitting rivals against each other and thus consolidating his own position. The women at court played a role that should not be underestimated. Mistresses such as Madame de Montespan or later Madame de Maintenon had considerable influence on the king and thus on politics and court life. Behind the magnificent facades of Versailles, not only festivals raged, but also struggles for proximity, influence, and power. Versailles was also a place of culture. Theater performances, concerts, balls, and masquerades determined life. Artists, musicians, and writers found support here, but also a stage that tied them to the king's rule. The court was thus not only a center of politics, but also of art, where one was inextricably linked with the other. But this glamour also had a dark side. Versailles was overcrowded. Sometimes several thousand people lived in the palace at the same time. Lack of space, poor hygienic conditions, and tensions between the residents were just as much a part of everyday life as the magnificent ceremonies. Behind the shiny facade was often a hard life crushed by rules. Nevertheless, life at the court of Versailles was unique. It was a play that was performed daily, a ritual of power that amazed Europe. For the Sun King, it was the perfect staging, himself as the centerpiece, surrounded by a court that worshipped, observed, imitated him, and thus unintentionally served his control. Chapter 8: Versailles as the center of power, politics, and control. Versailles was not just a palace, not just a stage for ceremonies and celebrations. It was the political heart of France. Under Louis XIV, the castle became the embodiment of absolutism, the form of government in which the king combined all power in his person. Versailles was thus not a mere residence, but an instrument of rule. Louis XIV's political system was based on a simple but effective principle: power through proximity and control. By attracting the nobility to his court, he deprived them of the opportunity to build up their own centers of power in the provinces. If you wanted influence, you had to live in Versailles, and there you were constantly exposed to the king's gaze. This dependence weakened the old noble families and turned them into courtiers who invested their energy in clothing, etiquette, and intrigue instead of political ambitions. At the same time, Louis XIV strengthened the central administration. Ministers such as Colbert, finance, Louvois, military, and Letellier worked directly under his supervision. Decisions were no longer made in distant councils, but in the castle itself, often in the king's cabinets. Versailles was a gigantic administrative center where politics, finance, military, and culture converged. The architecture supported this mechanism. The king's rooms were in the center of the castle, and everything was organized around them. Anyone who wanted access had to overcome the strict hierarchies. Even the proximity to the king's apartments was a symbol of rank. In this way, Versailles translated the political order into a spatial structure. The closer to the king, the greater the power. But Versailles was not only important domestically, it was also a diplomatic showcase. Envoys from all over Europe traveled to the court to see the Sun King. They were welcomed in the magnificent halls, experienced festivals, music, and ceremonies, and took the impression of an outstanding, invincible power with them to their homeland. Versailles was thus an instrument of international politics, a stage on which France staged itself as Europe's leading nation. Control over culture was also part of this power strategy. Louis XIV promoted artists, musicians, and writers, but he bound them to the court. Art thus became a tool of domination. Plays, paintings, and music were not only used for entertainment, but also for propaganda. They glorified the king, portrayed him as a hero, godlike, or father of the people. This close connection between politics and representation made Versailles unique. The palace was not a neutral space, but a deliberate instrument of staging power. Every stone, every ceremony, every festival served the same goal: to present the king as the center of the state. But Versailles was also a place of control. The courtiers were disciplined by the constant presence of the nobility, by strict etiquette, and by the eye of the king. Intrigues and rivalries continued to exist, but they took place within the framework set by the king. In this way, Louis XIV transformed potential opponents into spectators and players in his great play of power. In Versailles, politics, architecture, and society merged into a whole. The castle was not only the backdrop, but the engine of the absolute monarchy. It made power visible, palpable, and inescapable. Anyone who entered Versailles experienced directly that the king was the center here, and that everything else had to be subordinate to him. Chapter 9: Art and Culture in Versailles. Music, Theater, and Painting. Versailles was not only a political and architectural masterpiece, but also a center of art and culture. Under Louis XIV and his successors, the palace became a stage on which not only power, but also creativity and beauty were staged. Music, theater, dance, painting, and sculpture merged here to form a total work of art that glorified the glory of the king and made France the leading cultural power in Europe. From the very beginning, Louis XIV attached great importance to the promotion of music. Even as a young king, he was a dancer himself and appeared in courtly ballets where he embodied the sun god Apollo, an image that was later reflected in his nickname, Sun King. His court composer Jean-Baptiste Lully became the driving force behind a new French musical tradition. Lully's operas, ballets, and festive music accompanied life at Versailles, adding the appropriate splendor to every ceremony, feast, and ceremony. Painting and sculpture were also entirely in the king's service. The painter Charles Le Brun, premier peintre du roi, had a decisive influence on the artistic design of the castle. He was not only an artist, but also an organizer and designer. Under his direction, the halls, galleries, and ceiling paintings were decorated with scenes that glorified the king. In the Galerie des Glaces, for example, the frescoes show central events from Louis's reign: victories in the war, political reforms, buildings, always with the king as the hero of history. The sculptures in the gardens and squares of Versailles followed the same program: gods and heroes of antiquity, allegories of virtues and forces of nature, they all represented Louis XIV as a ruler who brought order to the world. In particular, the sun god Apollo, with whom the king identified himself, was omnipresent. The theater also played a central role. Plays by Molière, who is considered one of the greatest French playwrights, were premiered in Versailles. Works such as Tartuffe or The Misanthrope combined entertainment with moral teaching and were at the same time part of the courtly production. Molière worked closely with Lully so that theater, music, and dance merged into magnificent spectacles. In addition to these great arts, everyday life at court was also permeated by culture. Parties, masked balls, opera performances, and fireworks were regular events that structured the year. In Versailles, art was not just decoration, but an indispensable part of the exercise of power. It shaped perception, it directed attention, it made the king appear in a splendor that went beyond the everyday. Versailles was thus a cultural center of European standing. Artists from all over Europe came to work at court or to be inspired. The French style, characterized by order, symmetry, and classical harmony, became the benchmark for other courts. Music, dance, fashion, and architecture from Versailles spread across the continent and made France a leading cultural nation. But culture in Versailles was never an end in itself. It was always part of the great project to make the king's reign visible. Art, music, and theater served not only to show the power of the king, but to make it tangible. They were the soul of the courtly spectacle that was performed day after day in Versailles. Chapter 10. The Role of the Queens, Marie-Thérèse, Madame de Maintenon, Marie Antoinette. As much as Versailles was shaped by the splendor of Louis XIV and his successors, women also played a central role at court. Queens, wives, mistresses, and later rulers such as Marie Antoinette shaped life in Versailles in their own way. They were not only companions, but actors who influenced politics, culture, and the image of the court. The first queen to mint Versailles was Marie-Thérèse of Spain, the wife of Louis XIV. She was considered pious, gentle, and modest, but at court she remained in the shadow of her overpowering husband. Versailles was often a lonely place for them, as Louis had numerous mistresses who played a far greater role in social and political life. Nevertheless, the queen had an important function. She embodied the dynastic connection between France and Spain and served as a symbol of legitimacy. Their presence was part of the courtly ritual, even if their personal influence remained small. Madame de Maintenon, first governess of the royal children, later secret second wife of Louis XIV, played a far greater role. She had no official title, but her influence over the king was enormous. She was educated, clever, and deeply religious. Under their effect, the atmosphere in Versailles shifted. The excessive celebrations of the king's youth gave way to a more serious, pious mood. It was also Madame de Maintenon who supported the creation of the Saint Cyr Girls' School, a project that strengthened her reputation in France. It shows that women at court were able to exercise political power indirectly, not through titles, but through proximity to the king. A century later, another woman whose name is inextricably linked with Versailles came to the fore: Marie Antoinette. The Austrian princess, wife of Louis XVI, became the most tragic figure in the history of the castle. She came to Versailles in 1770 as a young woman, bringing with her a fresh, unconventional energy. But soon she was at the center of criticism and scandals. Marie Antoinette loved luxury, fashion, and pleasure. Her extravagant dresses, her passion for theater, and her tendency to retire to the Petit Trianon with a small group of confidants earned her the accusation of waste and arrogance. In particular, the Hameau de la Reine, her idyllic farming village in the Park of Versailles, was seen by critics as a symbol of unworldly decadence. As the queen, she played the farmer's wife while the people suffered from hunger. But Marie Antoinette was also a victim of propaganda and character assassination. Many scandals, such as the infamous necklace affair, in which she was falsely accused of being involved in a jewel fraud, were politically motivated. Her image as l'Autrichienne, the stranger, made her the target of hatred, which culminated in her execution in the turmoil of the Revolution. The fates of these queens and ladies-in-waiting show that Versailles was not only a stage of male power. Women had their own roles in this system, as symbolic figures, as moral forces, as style icons, or as scapegoats. Versailles was also a place of female presence, marked by influence, passion, and tragedy. Chapter 11. The Petit Trianon and the Hameau, Retreats in Versailles. As magnificent and imposing as the Palace of Versailles was, it had a downside: the lack of intimacy. For kings, queens, and courtiers, Versailles was a place of permanent publicity, a life under the eyes of others, determined by rituals, etiquette, and the incessant hustle and bustle of the court. The retreats within the complex became all the more important, small oases of peace that allowed one to escape the austerity and narrowness of courtly life. Two of these places are the Petit Trianon and the Hameau de la Reine. The Petit Trianon, an elegant pleasure palace in the Park of Versailles, was built in the 1760s under Louis XV. The king had it built for his mistress, Madame de Pompadour, to give her a private retreat. After her death, it became the property of her successor, Madame du Barry. With its simple, classical architecture designed by Ange-Jacques Gabriel, the Petit Trianon embodied a new aesthetic, less ostentatious than the main castle, but all the more harmonious and intimate. When Louis XVI ascended the throne, he gave the Petit Trianon to his wife Marie Antoinette. For the young queen, it became a place of freedom, far away from the strict ceremonial of the court. Here she was able to develop her own tastes, surround herself with close confidants, and lead a life that was more private and informal. In the rooms of the Petit Trianon, she cultivated a style that was lighter, more playful, and closer to nature than the monumental splendor of Versailles. This desire for naturalness was even more evident in the Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's village. From 1783 onwards, Marie Antoinette had an artificial farming village built in the Park of Versailles, with small half-timbered houses, gardens, mills, and ponds. Here she could go for walks with her friends, feed animals, and play an idyllic country life, admittedly in an idealized, romantic form far removed from any rural reality. The Hameau was an expression of a zeitgeist. In the second half of the 18th century, the idea of nature, of the simple life, inspired by philosophers such as Rousseau, gained popularity. Marie Antoinette embodied this spirit in her own way, but her passion for the game in the farming village was heavily criticized by contemporaries. For many, it appeared as a symbol of decadence, a queen who imitated the simple life while the people were starving. Nevertheless, Petit Trianon and Hameau show the human side of court life. They prove how much even queens had the need for intimacy, peace, and naturalness, needs that could hardly be satisfied in the official framework of Versailles. Here, away from protocol, they could be themselves, experiment, and escape the constraints of everyday courtly life for a moment. Today, these retreats are a fascinating part of Versailles. They show not only the diversity of the complex, but also the tensions between power and humanity, between splendor and simplicity. They remind us that Versailles was not only a palace of politics, but also a living space full of longings, dreams, and escapes. Chapter 12. Versailles and Europe, Model for Royal Courts. The Palace of Versailles was not only the heart of France, but also a model for the whole of Europe. Hardly any other place in the 17th and 18th centuries exerted such a fascination on rulers, aristocrats, and architects. Versailles was not only a residence, but a manifesto, and many monarchs wanted to imitate this manifesto in their own countries. Even his contemporaries recognized that Versailles was much more than a palace. It was a staging of power that made France's claim to be Europe's leading nation visible. Diplomats, envoys, and foreign rulers who visited Versailles returned home deeply impressed. They told of the endless Galerie des Glaces, the magnificent gardens of Le Nôtre, the enormous festivals, and the unapproachable splendor of the Sun King. Versailles thus became an export hit of architecture and court culture. Palaces were built everywhere, imitating or varying the original. In Vienna, Emperor Leopold I had Schönbrunn Palace built, which clearly shows the inspiration from Versailles in its grounds and gardens. In Russia, Peter the Great had the Palace of Peterhof built near St. Petersburg, with water systems and axes that go directly back to Le Nôtre's garden art. In Prussia, too, palaces such as Charlottenburg and later Sanssouci in Potsdam followed the French fashion. But Versailles was not only an architectural model, but also a cultural model. The French court set standards for fashion, dance, language, and etiquette. French became the language of diplomacy. French clothing and hairstyles were imitated throughout Europe. And the courtly etiquette of Versailles found imitators at all the great courts. The Sun King had understood how to establish France's supremacy not only militarily and politically, but also culturally. This was particularly evident in music and theater. Composers like Lully or writers like Molière shaped an art form that was adopted throughout Europe. Opera houses, theaters, and ballet companies adopted the styles that had been developed in Versailles. Even rulers who were political rivals of France had their palaces and festivals decorated according to the French model, proof of how strong the cultural influence was. At the same time, Versailles was a place of European diplomacy. Contracts were negotiated here, guests were received, alliances were forged. The castle was both a stage and a tool. Every visit, every audience was part of a staging intended to demonstrate France's superiority. But with the imitation came criticism. Some contemporaries saw Versailles as the epitome of waste and decadence. Especially in the 18th century, when the costs for the court continued to rise and France ran into economic difficulties, the castle was increasingly seen as a symbol of a system that had lost touch with reality. Nevertheless, it remains indisputable. Versailles set standards. It was the archetype of the Baroque palace, a model that was copied countless times but never surpassed. To this day, it is synonymous with courtly culture and absolutist rule, a place whose radiance had an impact far beyond France and shaped the political and cultural landscape of Europe for centuries. Chapter 13: The 18th Century, Glamour and Crises. After Louis XIV turned Versailles into the shining center of his power, the palace entered a new phase in the 18th century. The splendor of the Sun King remained palpable, but under his successors, Louis XV and Louis XVI, the dark sides also became more pronounced. Versailles continued to be a place of courtly splendor, but also a stage for growing tensions that would eventually culminate in the storm of the Revolution. Louis XV, the great-grandson of the Sun King, reigned from 1715 to 1774. As a child, he ascended the throne and grew up in the shadow of the great Louis XIV. Initially, his government was marked by hope. He was even called the Much Beloved. But over the years, his popularity waned, not least because he was considered a reserved, often indecisive ruler. Versailles remained the center of the court, but the atmosphere changed. Under Louis XV, the castle was expanded and modernized. Particularly important was the creation of smaller, intimate spaces, a clear contrast to the monumentality of its predecessor. The king loved seclusion, and so rooms such as the private apartments or the Petit Trianon, which he dedicated to his mistress, Madame de Pompadour, were created. Versailles thus showed a new facet, less pompous but more personal, almost more human. Nevertheless, the costs of the farm remained enormous. The nobility continued to live in Versailles, the ceremonies and festivals continued, albeit less ostentatious than in the time of Louis XIV. But the gap between court and people grew. While Versailles indulged in luxury, France's economic situation deteriorated. Wars such as the 7 Years' War put a strain on finances, and the ordinary population suffered from high taxes. With Louis XVI, 1774 to 1792, a king took office who led Versailles into a new era. He was good-natured and educated, but often politically hesitant. Versailles remained the center of power, but it also increasingly became a symbol of alienation. His wife, Marie Antoinette, brought glamour and scandal to the palace at the same time. Their spending on fashion, festivals, and a famous hameau de la reine caused outrage, and the court was increasingly seen as a symbol of decadence. At the same time, the Enlightenment gained influence. Philosophers such as Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu questioned the system of absolutism. While courtly receptions continued to take place in the Hall of Mirrors, freedom, equality, and the rights of the people were discussed in the salons of Paris. During this time, Versailles increasingly seemed like a relic of a perishing world, magnificent but frozen. Thus, the 18th century in Versailles became a time of contrast. The palace still radiated splendor and grandeur, but at the same time it was riddled with crises. The luxury of the court stood in sharp contrast to the plight of the people. Behind the golden facades, things began to seethe, and the voices for change became louder and louder. Versailles may not have suspected it, but the end of an era was inexorably approaching. Chapter 14. Marie Antoinette. Luxury, Scandals, and the End of an Era. If there is one name that is inextricably linked with the late Versailles, it is that of Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France before the Revolution. She was born Archduchess of Austria in 1755 and married Louis XVI in 1770 to consolidate the alliance between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons. At the age of only 14, she came to Versailles, a girl who stepped into a world that was determined by splendor, but also by intrigues and the strictest rules. Initially, the young queen brought freshness and charm to the court. She was fun-loving, loved fashion, music, and theater, and she soon captivated many admirers. But just as quickly, she became the target of suspicion and criticism. The French saw in her the Austrian, a stranger who was influencing the heart of France. This flaw was to accompany her throughout her life. Marie Antoinette soon developed a reputation for extravagance and waste. Her passion for fashion was legendary. Always new robes, elaborate hairstyles, extravagant accessories. She became a fashion icon in Europe, but the costs of doing so weighed on the already ailing state coffers. For the people, who suffered from hunger and poverty, the queen with her magnificent dresses was the symbol of a decadent court that had no idea of reality. Another target of criticism was her preference for the Petit Trianon and the Hameau de la Reine. In this idyllic, peasant world, the queen sought relaxation far away from the strict ceremonial of the main castle. Here she played a rural life with friends, fed chickens, or went for a walk in the garden. For them, it was an attempt to experience naturalness and simplicity. For their critics, it was an insult, a queen imitating peasant life while real peasants were in need. The notorious collar affair of 1785 was particularly fatal. Although Marie Antoinette was indeed innocent, the rumor spread that she had tried to acquire an extremely precious diamond necklace. In the eyes of the people, this only confirmed her image as Madame Deficit, the lavish queen who plunged the country into misery. The scandal ruined her reputation for good. At the same time, Marie Antoinette was politically isolated. Her husband, Louis XVI, was good-natured but often indecisive, and she herself had only limited influence over the government. Nevertheless, she became a symbolic figure for everything that was criticized about the Ancien Régime: wastefulness, arrogance, unworldliness. When the revolution broke out in 1789, Versailles was one of the first targets of anger. On October 5, the Parisian market women marched to Versailles, forced their way into the palace, and forced the royal family to move to Paris. This marked the end of Versailles' time as the center of power. Marie Antoinette was banished from the palace to the confines of the Tuileries Palace in Paris, and finally to prison. The Queen's last years were marked by humiliation and despair. In 1793, she was put on trial, accused of treason and waste. On October 16, 1793, she climbed the guillotine. Her death was not only the end of a queen, but also the final symbol of the fall of Versailles as a stage of power. Marie Antoinette remains an ambivalent figure to this day, admired as a fashion icon, despised as a symbol of decadence, regretted as a tragic queen who got caught up in the maelstrom of history. In Versailles, however, she left traces that make the contrast of the era visible, between splendor and abyss, between dream world and reality, between splendor and doom. Chapter 15: The French Revolution and the Fate of Versailles. When the French Revolution broke out in the summer of 1789, Versailles suddenly went from being a symbol of absolute power to a symbol of hatred of the Ancien Regime. No place embodied in the eyes of the people so much the extravagance and unworldliness of royalty as this palace with its gilded halls, its endless gardens, and its lavish court. On October 5, 1789, a turning point occurred, the March of the Market Women on Versailles. Thousands of Parisian women, enraged by hunger, bread shortages, and the king's inaction, marched on foot to Versailles. Accompanied by National Guardsmen, they stormed the castle, challenged the king, and even forced their way into Marie Antoinette's apartments. The queen narrowly escaped the violence of the crowd by fleeing through a secret passage. The message was unmistakable. Versailles was no longer an inviolable symbol of royal power, but a place where the people demanded their rights. On the same day, the royal family was forced to move to Paris, to the Tuileries. This marked the end of Versailles' time as the political center of France. The following years brought far-reaching changes for the castle. Many rooms that were once bursting with splendor have been abandoned. Works of art and furniture were confiscated to raise money for the Revolution and the Republic. Numerous treasures found their way onto the art market or were destroyed. Versailles, once full of life, began to fall into disrepair. But Versailles was not completely forgotten. The revolutionaries also saw the castle as a historical place that remained important. In 1792, it was partly used as a museum of French art, a foretaste of its later purpose. At the same time, it served as a storage facility, workshop, and even accommodation for soldiers. The former glory was covered by dust and decay. For Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, on the other hand, Versailles was finally a thing of the past. While they were under house arrest in Paris and later held in prisons, the castle remained a silent witness to the demise of the monarchy. The revolution had torn out the heart of the Ancien Regime. Versailles was now only an empty shell reminiscent of the past. The French Revolution turned Versailles into a system of memorials. What had once been the splendor of absolute power was now proof of its decadence and downfall. Many revolutionaries saw the endless galleries and gardens not as beauty but as waste, and this perception shaped the image of Versailles for many years. But Versailles was not to remain forever in the shadow of the revolution. In the 19th century, a new phase in its history began, the transformation from a royal palace to a national symbol and finally to a museum. Chapter 16: Versailles in the 19th century, from abandoned palace to museum. After the fall of the monarchy, Versailles was no longer the seat of power. What had once been the heart of French absolutism stood empty and abandoned after 1789. The splendor of the Mirror Gallery had faded, the gardens were overgrown, furniture and works of art had been sold or plundered. Versailles seemed like a symbol of a bygone era that had irretrievably come to an end. In the 19th century, however, a new phase in the history of the castle began. France's changing regimes, from Napoleon's empire to the Bourbon Restoration to the Second Empire, were faced with the question of what to do with this gigantic structure. Initially, Versailles was used pragmatically. It served as a camp, as a military academy, and at times also as accommodation for soldiers. The idea that Versailles could become a political center again had long since evaporated. The decisive impetus for the rediscovery of Versailles was given by King Louis Philippe I, who ascended the throne in 1830 after the July Revolution. He no longer wanted to use the palace as a residence, but to give it a new meaning. Versailles was to become a museum of French history, open to the public and free of monarchical ceremonies. From the 1830s onwards, Louis Philippe had parts of the castle restored and rebuilt at great expense. Numerous halls were redesigned to house paintings and statues depicting the history of France from the Merovingians to the present day. The Hall of Battles, Galerie des Batailles, became particularly famous, where monumental paintings showed the great military successes of France, from Charles Martel to Napoleon. Versailles was thus transformed into a national symbol. It no longer stood only for the rule of the Bourbons, but for the whole of French history. The decision to open the castle to the people marked a decisive break with its past. Versailles was no longer an exclusive court, but a public place where the nation grappled with its own history. In the course of the 19th century, Versailles also became a scene of political events. The year 1871 was particularly formative, when the German Empire was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors. After the victory in the Franco-German War, this place was deliberately chosen to stage the seizure of power. Versailles once again became a symbol, but this time not of France's triumph, but of its humiliation. This event left a deep wound in the French national consciousness. Despite such political tensions, Versailles remained above all a museum in the 19th century, a place of remembrance and national self-assurance. Restorations were carried out to save the palace from final decay. Visitors from all over the world came to marvel at the splendor of bygone times. Thus, the abandoned palace of the 18th century became a new symbol in the 19th century. Versailles no longer stood for the absolute monarchy, but for the history of France in all its breadth, its heyday as well as its defeats. Chapter 17. The Treaty of Versailles, 1919. Versailles as a place of world history. On June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination attempt in Sarajevo, the Palace of Versailles once again became the center of world history. In the magnificent Hall of Mirrors, in the room that once glorified the power of the Sun King and had become the stage for the proclamation of the German Empire in 1871, the victorious powers and the defeated German Empire signed the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty officially ended the First World War and forever made Versailles a symbol of political decisions of global significance. The choice of location was made deliberately. France wanted to avenge the humiliation of 1871. At that time, the German Empire had celebrated its founding in the same hall after the victory over France in the Franco-German War. Now the roles were reversed. Versailles became the place where Germany had to acknowledge its defeat. The negotiations that led to the contract had lasted for months. Diplomats, politicians, and advisors from all over the world gathered in the corridors and halls of Versailles. Names such as Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, and David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, shaped the discussions. Each brought his own ideas. Wilson, the idea of a new world order with the League of Nations. Clemenceau, the pursuit of security and retribution. Lloyd George, the attempt at compromise. The result was a treaty that remained controversial in its severity. Germany had to accept large territorial losses, drastically reduce its army, and above all, make enormous reparation payments. Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, which attributed sole responsibility for the war to Germany, became particularly notorious. For the victors, Versailles was a triumph. For many Germans, on the other hand, the treaty was a dictated peace that was perceived as unjust. In the Weimar Republic, he had a lasting influence on the political climate. He nourished resentment that was later exploited by radical forces such as the National Socialists. The Hall of Mirrors, once a symbol of royal power, thus became a symbol of international politics, and at the same time, a space of remembrance of defeats and humiliations. Versailles had long since lost its role as a palace, but as the scene of historic decisions, it remained of global importance. The image of the signing, with the long tables, the serious faces of the delegates, and the mirrors in the background, went around the world. Versailles thus became the place not only of French history, but of world history. The Treaty of 1919 had a decisive impact on the 20th century. Although it ended the First World War, it created new conflicts that eventually led to the Second World War. Versailles was thus not only the scene of peace, but also a place where the seeds for new catastrophes were planted. Versailles thus remained a symbol with many faces: Palace of Kings, Museum of the Nation, and stage on which world politics made history. Chapter 18: Restoration and Preservation, Versailles in the 20th Century. After the First World War and the signing of the Treaty of 1919, Versailles was more than ever a world-famous symbol. But at the same time, the castle faced a huge challenge: preservation. Centuries of intensive use, neglect during the Revolution, and eventful fates in the 19th century had left their mark. Versailles was magnificent, but it was also threatened by decay, by the ravages of time, and by the enormous costs that its care devoured. Versailles had already found its function as a museum in the 19th century, but in the 20th century, this role was anchored even more strongly. Historians, architects, and politicians recognized that Versailles was not only a national, but a worldwide cultural heritage that needed to be preserved. Extensive restoration work has been planned and carried out, often supported by private foundations and international fundraising campaigns. Especially in the period after the Second World War, Versailles faced new tasks. The castle itself was hardly directly affected by the fighting in 1940 and 1944, but the post-war years brought financial bottlenecks that made it difficult to maintain. Nevertheless, ambitious restoration programs began in the 1950s and 60s. Roofs, facades, and gardens were renewed, ornate rooms were lavishly restored, and the collections were supplemented. The second half of the 20th century brought a decisive turning point when Versailles was increasingly understood as an international symbol. Fundraisers like Rockefeller Jr. in the 1920s, or later, international partnerships, made it possible to bear the huge costs. This age showed that Versailles was not only a French heritage, but a treasure of humanity. At the same time, tourism grew. Millions of visitors flocked to the palace annually to see the Hall of Mirrors, the royal apartments, and the endless gardens. Versailles became one of the most visited museums in the world. But this popularity brought new challenges. The large number of visitors put a strain on the sensitive rooms, so that solutions were constantly sought to find the balance between preservation and accessibility. The gardens also received great attention. The elaborate water features, which for centuries formed the heart of the complex, had to be renewed and modernized. Statues have been restored, avenues have been replanted, and the original geometry of Le Nôtre has been preserved. The result is a total work of art that is centuries old, but must be maintained and preserved again and again. In the 20th century, Versailles was also used several times as a political arena. State visits, summits, and ceremonial receptions took place in the castle, which thus retained its function as a stage of power, albeit in a new form. The G7 summit in 1982 was particularly symbolic when leading statesmen and women met in the Hall of Mirrors where kings and diplomats had previously made history. Versailles in the 20th century was thus a place of restoration and rediscovery. A palace that was on the verge of collapse after the Revolution became a well-kept monument of international standing. It was no longer the private residence of a king, but an open space that belongs to all people, a symbol that history can be preserved and shared. Chapter 19: Versailles Today, Museum, World Heritage Site, and Tourist Magnet. Today, the Palace of Versailles is much more than a monument to French history. It is a world-class museum, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and a place that attracts millions of visitors from all over the world every year. Versailles has lost its political function, but its symbolic appeal is greater than ever. The number of visitors is impressive. Year after year, around 8 million people flock to the facility. You come to see the famous Galerie des Glaces, the halls of mirrors, the royal apartments, and the endless gardens. For many, Versailles is a highlight of every trip to France, a place where history can be experienced directly. But Versailles is not just a palace, but a total work of art. Anyone who walks through the rooms enters a world in which architecture, painting, sculpture, and gardens have merged into a single entity. The visitor experiences not only the splendor of the monarchy, but also the vision of an era in which power was staged through beauty. The careful restoration makes it possible to experience the palace as it's shown in the 17th and 18th centuries, a living image of the Baroque. The gardens of André Le Nôtre are a central attraction. The long avenues, the geometric beds, the statues and fountains captivate millions of walkers. Particularly popular are the performances of the Grand Zoo, during which the historic trick fountains are put back into operation. In these moments, the old splendor comes alive once again, and visitors experience something of the fascination that the contemporaries of the Sun King already felt. But Versailles is not only a tourist attraction, but also a place of research and education. Historians, architects, and art experts are constantly working to preserve and research the heritage. Archives, exhibitions, and publications make Versailles an important center of historical scholarship. The international importance of Versailles is also reflected in its role as a political and cultural arena. Again and again, the castle serves as a backdrop for state visits, summit meetings, or festive occasions. When presidents or monarchs from all over the world are received in the Hall of Mirrors, the tradition of the palace as a place of diplomacy is deliberately taken up. At the same time, Versailles has found its place in pop culture. Films, series, books, and fashion repeatedly draw on the images and stories associated with the castle. Whether as a romantic backdrop, a symbol of luxury, or the setting for dramatic events, Versailles has long since become part of the global imagination. Of course, the enormous popularity also brings challenges. The influx of visitors puts a strain on the sensitive rooms, and the maintenance of such a huge facility requires enormous financial resources. But thanks to state support, international cooperation, and private foundations, the palace has so far been preserved. So Versailles today is more than a museum. It is a lively place where past and present merge. A place that tells stories of kings and queens, of power and splendor, of revolution and downfall. And a place that also inspires the imagination of millions of people who visit, photograph, explore, or let it live on in their dreams. Chapter 20. The Myth of Versailles, Symbol of Power, Art, and History. Today, Versailles is much more than a palace made of stone, glass, and gold. It is a myth, a symbol that has taken on new meanings over the centuries. No other palace in the world so strongly combines the opposites of splendor and decline, of power and powerlessness, of beauty and political tragedy. When Louis XIV made Versailles the stage for his reign, it was the symbol of absolutism. Every room, every garden path, every ceremonial embodied the idea that the king was the center of the state, like the sun was the center of the sky. Versailles became a dream of control and order, a monument to power that impressed and intimidated all of Europe. But at the same time, Versailles has always been a place of contradictions. Behind the magnificent facades was a courtyard full of intrigues, rivalries, and tensions. While the gardens radiated strict geometry and harmony, discontent simmered in France. Versailles was so much a symbol of royalty that it inevitably became the target of anger during the Revolution. The myth of splendor was transformed into the myth of decadence. Versailles became a symbol of the aloofness of the monarchy. In the 19th century, the castle took on a new meaning. It became a museum of the nation, a place where France confronted its own history, the victories as well as the defeats. Versailles was no longer just the Bourbon Palace, but part of the country's collective memory. With the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, the palace entered world history. The place, which once stood for royal triumph, became the stage for a peace agreement that changed the world order, and at the same time created new conflicts. The Hall of Mirrors thus finally became a global symbol, a space in which history was not only told, but made. Today, the myth of Versailles lives on in a new form. For millions of visitors, the castle is a place of longing, a longing for beauty, for splendor, for a past that shines in gold and marble. At the same time, it is also a place of reflection, about power, its staging, and its transience. Versailles is therefore more than a monument. It is a mirror in which each epoch finds its own ideas. For the kings, it was the embodiment of their power. For the revolutionaries, the symbol of decadence. For the 19th century, a museum of the nation. For the 20th century, a place of global political decisions. And for us today, a cultural heritage that combines beauty, history, and humanity. So Versailles remains a living myth. It tells not only of kings and queens, of gardens and halls of mirrors, but also of the question of how people express their power, their dreams, and their identity through architecture and culture. Versailles is history made of stone and at the same time a dream that lives on to this day.